There we go. All right, everybody. So welcome to Life Science Cafe. My name is Julia. I'm a PhD student in the Neuroscience and Behavior program at UMass, and I'll be the MC today. Established in 2011, Life Science Cafe is organized by graduate student researchers at the University of Massachusetts Amherst. Each month, we invite different experts to discuss their research. Typically, we host these events in the Amherst community, but we are happy to continue our efforts virtually during this interesting time. We would like to thank our funders, the Organismic and Evolutionary Biology Program, the Graduate Student Senate, and the Graduate School at UMass, the National Science Foundation, and our generous UMass Gives donors. For our next event, we'll be discussing plants and chemicals they make with Dr. Rosemary Malfi on November 12th. Subscribe to our mailing list to stay tuned for future cafes, and expect to see an email about that within the next coming week. So for today, I'm going to stop sharing. We'll switch over. So today we are very excited, however, to have Dr. Rosemary Malfi with us to talk about her work on bees. Dr. Malfi is currently a postdoc at UMass working with Dr. Lynn Adler. And thank you very much for joining us today.
Yes, thank you. Thank you for having me.
All right, so while people still keep filtering in, we're going to ask some kind of like background, get to know you questions.
Sure.
And one thing we generally start off with was just like, generally, how did you get interested in the work that you do?
Yeah, as an undergraduate, I knew that I wanted to do some kind of biology, but I didn't know what kind. And it was really through a research experience as an undergraduate that set me on this trajectory. I went to a pretty small school, so there was one ecologist on the faculty, not a department of them. And I think he joined the faculty my sophomore year. His name is Neil Williams, and he happened to be studying pollination biology and pollination science. So what I found really compelling about his work was that, he was looking at crop pollination, and he described trying to understand how land use influences, bee communities, and then how that has a sort of knock-on effect on crop pollination to target crop. And I loved how I could connect sort of those basic research questions to their application in the real world. And they clearly have implications for farmers, for land managers, and even for policy. So I found that really compelling. And once I started doing research on bees, I never looked back. They're really fascinating, and it's hard not to fall in love with them.
Yeah, I understand that completely. And so I know this is a hard question for everyone, like grad school and post-grad school, but do you have other interests that have influenced your career, or vice versa, a career that has led to like interests outside of just the traditional research scope?
Yeah, it's a hard question right now. I am the mom of actually two small kids. So right now, my whole extracurricular life is like that and remote learning for my first grader. But once upon a time, I think my one of my primary interests outside of my research has been a community service. So if I think back to my Charlottesville days, so I should say I got my PhD at the University of Virginia in Charlottesville, Virginia. And when I was a graduate student there, I spent a lot of time volunteering in a local public housing community. And that was mostly through an after-school program that was hosted at a recreation center in that neighborhood. And it wasn't science-based. It was just sort of tutoring and mentoring. And that was for elementary school students. And at the same time, over the years I was there, my husband is a special educator. So he was an educator at the high school at that time. And so together we were involved in sort of multiple efforts to try and bring resources into that community. But what I think was really clear to me, what I came to recognize was that, even though this neighborhood was literally around the corner from the university, the folks who lived there did not feel a part of that university community.
Yeah.
So I, gained that recognition while I was there. And I think it really gave me perspective as, obviously a citizen, but also as a scientist and a person who is a part of a university community and has been for a long time, that those walls are pretty thick, and we have a responsibility to break them down and punch walls in them and try to bring university resources to bear on our local communities in a way that make them feel a part of the university in some way.
Yeah, so like speaking on that, I think are there any like diversity initiatives you want to highlight or discuss how you tie in these sort of discussion diversity efforts into your work today?
Sure. At that time, I have done a little less in the way of this in recent years, mostly just because as a postdoc, I've moved around now a bit. But when I was sort of planted in that community in Charlottesville, I did a lot of K through 12 work, also in part because I had an inroad there because my husband was working at the local high school. And so those efforts really were focused on delivering hands-on, authentic research experiences to students with the specific purpose of bringing underrepresented students sort of on board and trying to get them involved in STEM. And, that I remember myself, doing those kinds of hands-on activities as a middle schooler. I remember like doing this conference type thing, and I met a marine biologist, and I got to poke like shark organs, and I met this woman marine biologist, and I'll never forget it. It was really impactful. And so those are the kinds of experiences that I try to work on and deliver for students now. And I would say in more recent years, but also as a graduate student, what I've been involved in is undergraduate research mentoring. So I've been very involved with an REU program for anyone out there who might be a high school student or a college student or high school teacher. This is a National Science Foundation funded program, Research Experiences for Undergraduate program, that very key is funded. So it funds students to do a research experience, usually for like 10 weeks over the summer. And I've been involved in some of like the professional development aspects, program development aspects of REUs, and then also being sort of a direct mentor. So I've done it through that specific program, and then have also just tried to incorporate lots of undergraduates into my work over time.
That's
And
awesome.
yeah, they're very much my collaborators.
Yeah, it's great hearing about these sorts of projects, and it's really a great resource. And thank you so much for sharing so much about what you do.
Yeah.
So to move more into like the research that you do, so one of these conversations, we're going to give everybody a short poll, kind of involve the test their knowledge on bees and see what we still have to show them a little bit. So everyone, you're going to see a quiz pop up in just a minute. Just click on it. It's 5 questions. Do a quick little selection, and it'll essentially just be a quick little interactive thing. Feel free to just answer. And then we'll show you your results and see how many experts we have out in the field. Not bad. I'm impressed so far. All right, we've got some decent bee experts, but there's definitely some things that I think we could still do. So I'm gonna share my screen real quick. And so you all did very well. It's better than I did before I did the thing. So I'm gonna show you the answers, which is actually quite surprising. And I learned a lot just from talking to you, I know initially in the conversation, but there's over 20,000 bees in the world was one of the types of bees was one of the most shocking things for me. And then I think like just the number of bees you could find in a healthy colony is even more than the number of bees there are was quite impressive to me as well. So I think that's always an interesting one. So thank you, everybody. You guys did good, but I think we have a little bit more that we can learn. So, all right. So to get started on bee-related questions. So first question I want to ask you is, so what do bees really do to kind of help the world? And why are they here? What do they do?
Yeah, so I'm going to start sharing my screen. Okay. Can you see my screen? Oh, yay. Okay. Sometimes I never know. Never know when you click if it's really going to work. Okay. So yes, the question is, what do bees do, right? What do they do? Yeah. So I probably the most obvious answer is that they are deeply connected to our food supply. This is some people might actually recognize this because it kind of went viral, I feel like, a few years ago. This is but it's actually still one of my favorite visuals. This is a grocery store, and these are your produce choices with bees, and then your produce choices without bees. And what it tries to illustrate is that, about a third of our food supply is pollination dependent, specifically dependent on animal vectored pollination. And the majority of that pollination is delivered by bees. So this is a really good visual. There are some nuances here, like oranges stay here. That's because they can be self-fertilized, and but there's a nuance there in that if they have pollinators, if it's cross-pollinated, the fruit they get higher fruit yield and the fruit is better. So
that's a good thing to know. Is there any difference? Is there something special about bees in particular versus other pollinators? Because I know there's other bugs that can also pollinate. Why aren't they picking up kind of like the slack?
Yeah, so there are a number of pollinating insects, right? People could probably name a few off the top of their head. People probably think about butterflies, certainly bees, and then maybe to a lesser extent, people might sort of off the cuff think flies and wasps. They are pollinators. I hate to say it. I know people aren't always that fond of wasps, but they are pollinators. But there are aspects of the biology of bees that sort of set them apart from these other pollinators. Some of it has to do with their sort of physiology. If you sort of compare a bee, if you think about a bumblebee, like the poster behind me, compared to a wasp, they have a very hairy body, which helps to trap pollen, compared to a wasp, which has a very smooth body. But all of that is sort of for a reason, which is that, bees, compared to these other insects, are specifically gathering pollen and nectar as their food sources. And they are the only one of this group of pollinating insects that is specifically gathering pollen for food.
Okay.
So wasps, flies, and even butterflies and moths, they are primarily visiting flowers for nectar. They're going there for the sugar source. And yes, they interact with the pollen-bearing parts of the plant, but bees, because they're foraging on pollen, are doing that much more directly and more often. So they tend to be responsible for more of the pollen flow in a community of plants flowering.
Okay. So do all bees end up doing the same thing? Because I know they've seen them on flowers as well. Are there like specialized bees, or do they all go to all different things?
Yeah, so some bees are, let's put this up here too as a visual. Some bees are specialists. So that means that they visit maybe one type of flower. More often it means they visit kind of like a subset of flowers. And usually, those flowers tend to be closely related. So like we know that there are some bees that specialize on Asteraceae, which is like the sunflower flower family. But many bees are also generalists. So, and the ones that you can probably think of off the top of your head, like honeybees and bumblebees, those we sort of generally consider to be generalists. Some of them are even super generalists, which mean they just visit kind of a wide range of things in the flowering community.
Awesome. So what types of bees do you work with? What's your like subset? Do you work with everything or just a specific one?
I don't work with everything. I mean, I work more with wild native species. So that tends to be more my area of focus. And then very specifically, most of my research has focused on bumblebees.
Okay.
So bumblebees are a whole genus. So there are actually 250 species of bumblebees in this group worldwide. In North America, there are about 50 historically, at least. Some have really declined or even gone extinct in recent decades. And they are mostly social species, with one exception, which maybe we'll get to later. But these social bees are they're different from honeybees. The most social bees that people think of are honeybees, which have these giant hives. They have a queen, they have a worker caste. Bumblebees are a little different in that their colonies they're not perennial, so they don't last year to year. But they do have an egg-laying queen and a worker caste. And this little diagram over here shows sort of their annual cycle. So a queen will emerge from hibernation in the spring. She then has a solitary part of her life, which honeybee queens don't. They swarm, so they always have friends with them. And the queen then founds a nest. She goes to another nesting site. She starts laying eggs. Then the worker force will sort of build and build over the course of the summer until it reaches, some point where the colony decides to switch to reproduction, and they make new queens, new males. They mate, and the queens that are mated will hibernate and come out the following year. So the queen survives basically one calendar year, and the colony survives for just a season.
Awesome. That's really cool. I think we'll take this point in time to make a little pause, and we'll let anybody ask any questions that they have for this segment before we move on to the next one. So just to remind anybody, if you have any questions, please just click on the question and answer at the bottom of the screen and type it out. Or if you would like to actually say it out loud, you can use the raise your hand function and we'll unmute you. So feel free to send it in.
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Go ahead.
Perfect. So quick kind of quasi like economics / B question. Are there any products on like, I don't know, that one might buy on a daily or weekly basis that kind of behave in the opposite way as, let's say, like almond milk, in that they are, at least highly publicized, or almond milk is highly publicized as like quote unquote killing bees? Are there products that we as consumers might want to purchase more of that might help the bee ecosystem?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think that almond milk is probably getting that label because it's often a very chemically intensive industry. And well, there are actually sort of a number of problems with almond production and sort of the way we farm in general. But in general, I would say, these food labels, not all of them carry a lot of weight. One of them that carries the most weight is the organic label. So if, one of the major concerns about bee health is pesticides. We're not going to overnight transform our farming system to stop being, huge monocultures. But we can, try and do our part to reduce pesticides. There's, it's not a perfect solution, but I think when possible, it's good to try and purchase organic. Even better is purchasing locally. I don't know where you're coming from, but here in Western Mass, we have a lot of small farms. Not all of them are organic certified, but they're almost functionally organic. So they don't go after the label because that involves a lot of red tape and jumping through hoops, but they functionally are. They have very low pesticide. So buying local from smaller growers is also potentially a good thing to do. Hopefully that answers your question.
Yeah.
All right, thank you. Then I think we have another verbal question. Hold on one second.
Yeah, I saw a hand.
All right. So I think we have a chatted one really quick as well. So we have a question more about kind of like wasps in general. So what kind of can you answer anything to like their pollinators in that kind of area? Like what do they do exactly that's helping in that area?
Yeah, so they are they're visiting they're visiting flowers as adults. So they are pollinators. When they visit nectar, they are also, coming into contact with the pollen-bearing parts of the plant. So that is one way, in which they are performing sort of an ecosystem, ecosystem service or function. They're also predators. So, the distinction between bees and wasps is that bees are foraging. Their primary protein source and fat source is pollen. So they're gathering that protein source somewhat to eat it themselves, but mostly to feed to the larvae, the baby bees in the nest. Wasps, on the other hand, their primary protein source is other insects. So they're hunters. And, that can mean that they're actually keeping some pest populations in check, because they're, depending on the wasp, some of them are also generalist foragers. They forage on a lot of different things. Some of them are specialist foragers that will only hunt for like spiders or whatever. But in general, when you have like a healthy wasp population, you're also keeping other insect populations, including things like crop pests, in check.
Okay, awesome. So we definitely have more questions now that we're going to get to in the next section, but we're going to move on to the next one real quick just so we can stay on time. And don't worry, we'll try to get to everybody's questions. All right, so the next question that I want to just ask you really quick is, so like how does a bee get sick? So I know you study kind of like the health of bees, but like what does that mean?
Yeah, so how does a bee get sick?
Yeah.
So bees, just like any organism you can think of, including humans, they have pathogens. So that includes bacteria and viruses, and parasites, like microscopic parasites. And I would say the primary mode of transmission for these things is what we call an orophycal route. You can probably gather what that means. So a bee will land on a flower, it defecates, and then the next bee will come to that flower and drink from it, and then ingest the feces of that previous bee and acquire its parasites or viruses. So that's the primary way that gets transmitted. So that happens at flowers, which is how you would get sort of cross nest or cross colony transmission. It also, of course, happens within nests too. So if it's a social species, those diseases can also be transmitted within a colony.
Okay, well, what does a sick bee look like though?
Yeah, so it depends, but in general, so if you study bee behavior and you kind of know what's normal for a bee, you tend to figure out what doesn't look normal. Bees are, the phrase is busy bees, right? They're always kind of moving and doing their thing. So when bees are kind of immobile, or if they're slow, if you see them on the ground and they're not flying, I mean, one here and there, I mean, it might just be a bee that's sort of senescing, it's reaching the end of its life. But if you see sort of more than that, then something else might be going on.
All right. So what kind of like different parasites are there and how do they affect the bees? Are they all, I mean, parasite is inherently bad, but are there like little bugs that help the bees, or are they all just really kind of toxic to them?
Yeah. So I guess, so there are microbes that are potentially beneficial to a bee. So we think of them as being, commensals or maybe symbionts, just like us, like we have microbiota in our gut, right? The gut microbiome is a big topic of interest. Bees also have that. So they have like natural microbiota in them that can also be disrupted and cause a problem. So there are sort of like good bacteria and fungi that are part of their microbiota naturally. Parasites, though, in general, are pretty much just harmful. And then the pathogens that I specifically study, a little context dependent, but they generally have what we call fitness impacts. They impact, the lifespan of bees and ultimately reproduction.
Okay. So which parasites are you studying? Which ones are you working with?
Yeah, so I have a few different ones here that we could come back to if folks are interested, but these are kind of the ones I study bumblebees, and I have I'll get to the other one, but I have worked with some of these internal parasites. So these are microscopic organisms. The one all the way to the left is Nosema bombi. So that it's an intracellular fungal parasite. So it's a fungus, but it has these little spores that replicate inside of cells. So it can actually become a systemic infection. This is considered to be pretty virulent. There's also other Nosema species that occur in honeybees, which are also considered to be a pretty big problem. They can, increase mortality and are generally pretty bad for a colony to get.
And I'm noticing that it's called Bombus. So does that mean it can only affect the bumblebees and then they can't spread in between species?
Yeah. So for the first part of that, this is a bumblebee specific Nosema. There are the other two that people might have heard of are Nosema cerani and Nosema apis, and those occur in honeybees. So that second part, though, we can find pathogens of one species in other species. So you can find like honeybee viruses and parasites in bumblebees sometimes, but there's a question about whether they actually are pathogenic. So we know that Nosema bombi is pathogenic in bumblebees. It causes infections which have consequences. Just because we find those other things in bumblebees doesn't necessarily mean that it's making them very ill.
Okay.
If that makes sense. Yeah.
So what exactly are these parasites doing? So what's like the biology behind it? How does it actually affect the bees?
Yeah, I mean, so Nosema, again, is an intracellular infection. So it first starts out in the gut, and then it starts to infect the kidneys, and then can sort of overrun a bee's tissues. So that is kind of how that one operates. Crithidia bombi, which is the one in the middle, and is the one that I've studied probably most, and the Adler lab studies pretty heavily, is something called a trypanosome. So if anyone's ever heard of like African sleeping sickness or Chagas disease, those are trypanosomes that humans sick. And so this is a trypanosome that that bumblebees get, and it's a gut parasite specifically. So it only lives in the gut. It doesn't leave the gut. It lives and replicates in the gut. So this one only lives in the gut, so it doesn't create these systemic infections, but it can do things like impair learning if the infections are pretty bad. And then depending on the context, like usually like the nutrition context, it can affect things like mortality in bees. But it's generally, I would say this one is, Nosema bombi is very virulent. It's considered virulent. Crithidia bombi is highly transmissible, but perhaps less virulent.
Okay. And a little clarification, when you say virulent versus transmissible, what does that mean exactly?
Yeah, so folks might be familiar with this now because of terminology from everything that's going on, but something that's very virulent causes, has a higher rate of like mortality. So there's a greater fitness cost, so increased mortality of individual bees. For social species, it would also then lead to decreased reproduction.
Okay.
Highly transmissible means it's passed very easily, but that doesn't mean that when bees get it, it's going to necessarily kill them, right?
All right.
And sort of in keeping with that, Nosema bombi tends to be actually less common in wild populations compared to Crithidia bombi. I mean, locally, like, sometimes like 50% of the bees you collect will have Crithidia, for example, whereas usually under 10, even under 5% will have something like Nosema.
All right. So we talked about the virulence a little bit, but is this like a big deal? Is this like a couple bees or a section of bees, or is this wiping out like entire colonies? What kind of like scale are we talking about when there's this infection?
Yeah, so I mean, Crithidia, as I mentioned, is very widespread, and it's actually a very genetically diverse parasite. So it is seemingly sort of everywhere. But again, whether it's not necessarily so virulent that it's killing off colonies. That said, if an infection gets really bad, which can happen for a sort of a variety of reasons, including, the host genetics, the parasite genetics, and then the environment in which those things are interacting, it can lead to things like delayed queen production, or if a queen is carrying it over winter, she may not be successful the next year. So those things do happen. Nosema, so this is not conclusive, but Nosema is suspected. So there are, as I mentioned, there are multiple bumblebees in the United States. There are 50. A handful of them over the last couple of decades have declined dramatically and very quickly. For example, some people may have heard of the rusty patch bumblebee. It was recently added to the endangered species list, which was a huge success for invertebrate conservationists. And it used to be one of the most common species on the East Coast. It is now not here. It can only be found in a very small portion of its range. And it's thought that Nosema bombi in particular may have been at least partly responsible for why those bees have declined. And the thinking behind that is that some of those bees are very closely related. So it's possible they were all more susceptible to this particular pathogen.
All right, interesting.
Yeah.
So we're going to take another pause real quick to ask some more questions. I know we have a couple people with their hands raised, so I'm going to go to Elizabeth first. So I'm going to allow you to talk. Hold on one second. All right, you should be able to unmute yourself now.
Okay, in the previous slide, there was a picture under the name next to the life cycle. And I guess it was the first one, next to the life cycle. Yes, that, can you tell me what that picture is of? What am I looking at?
The life cycle over here to the right?
No, oh no, that one's easy.
Oh.
Oh, I think the hive.
The hive, but
Oh, the
I don't.
Yes,
but
yes, okay, yes, I should have said, I probably should have said this. So I think in our minds, when we think about bee colonies, what comes to mind is that that very neat, elegant, sort of hexagonal, honeycomb that honeybees make. It's very beautiful. Bumblebees are very disorganized, and their nests are a lot more like haphazard. So this is a bumblebee brood structure. The queen, can you see my cursor? You can see my cursor, right? Okay, yeah. The queen is up here. She's this really big bee right here. These are, there might be some males in here, but these are all of her offspring, her daughter, the workers. And then this is the brood. So the larvae, the baby bees are in here. Right here, for example, you can sort of see these little spheres. Each of those is a larva that's actually differentiating out of an egg clump that was laid. So the bumblebees will actually kind of continually pierce those cells and deliver food into those to those larvae. So they're feeding them kind of individually. And then if you see these sort of openings, these are actually cocoons that emerged already. So the individuals came out of these cocoons, and then very cleverly, they use them as honey pots afterwards. So these will kind of stay there, and then they fill them all with nectar.
Resourceful.
Very resourceful.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. All right, so we have EH, which we're going to have. Oop, 1 second. Allow to talk. All right, I am going to temporarily promote you to panelist because otherwise I think you have an older type of Zoom, so you might pop up. But hold on 1 sec. All right, you should be able to unmute now.
How do bees learn?
How do bees learn? Yeah, that's a really good question. So believe it or not, bees actually do have brains. They have little brains. They have things called mushroom bodies, but they do actually have like small little central nervous system. But the way that they learn is really through experience. So they will go out to flowers, and they actually don't always know immediately how to manipulate all of the flowers that they find. They actually have to learn to do it. And the more they do it, the better they'll get at manipulating a particular kind of flowers. Some flowers are very open and some have a tubular structure. Sometimes they're even a little bit trickier than that. So bees have to sort of learn to manipulate those parts of a flower. They also learn through scent. So the bees that are foraging will bring sometimes scent back to the colony. And then the new bees that are emerging will kind of learn those scents that will help them navigate to resources out in the environment. That's at least how it works in bumblebees. In honeybees, they have a more complex communication where they dance and stuff like that. So yeah, hopefully, does that answer your question?
Yes.
Thank you very much. All right, so our next person is Jackie. So Jackie, I'm going to be allowing you to talk. I think you can unmute now. Yeah.
Hi, what can you tell me about carpenter bees? They're kind of tearing my house down.
Oh, I'm sorry. I'm actually.
How can I get rid of them?
Oh, how you can? Yeah, I'm actually quite fond of them. But here's a carpenter bee right here for anyone.
I saw that.
Yeah, so they're in this family, Apidae, which bumblebees are also in. Yeah, I mean, I think people do use pesticides to get rid of them. If you have a lot of them, it'd be pretty hard to keep filling up the holes. Typically, I guess if you don't want to use pesticides, the best method is something like prevention. So you treat the wood so that they're not really able to bore into it. But now that you already have that problem, if it's really bad, I guess, even though I'm so disinclined to say this, you might want to call an exterminator. but yeah, I mean, I'm very fond of carpenter bees, but I recognize that they're also that they can be a pest for people's homes. So
You definitely wouldn't be fond of them if you were me.
I know. I'm sorry. I know.
Tough situation.
I've been using a tennis racket.
Oh no.
You've been using it.
It works.
Yeah. So I hesitate to ever say to use pesticides, but I'm not aware of like a really effective method of eliminating them otherwise. But if I can, pest management is not necessarily my area of expertise, so I can also kind of look into that and see if there is a way to do that without using pesticides.
We can definitely post them on an update on our website.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
All right, thank you. I'm gonna do one more question that was sent in, and then we'll answer some more in the next section. And we've actually got some answers to you, so we can read that out in a little bit as well.
Ooh.
So we've got some people putting in. All right, so
is that about carpenter bee management?
It is about how to do simple traps with overturned bottles and stuff like that. So we'll discuss that and maybe post those on our website afterwards.
Nice.
For people with similar carpenter bee issues. All right, so one more is how disparate are the distribution of all the bee species? Do they cluster in the anticipated regions where other insects are enriched, or are there really unique kind of species without other species nearby geographically? So I think it's a question of, is there's lots of different bees mixed together, or do they each have their own little territories?
Yeah, that probably depends. I mean, there are some bees that have much smaller distributions. One of them, for example, was Bombus franklini. It's one of so many bumblebees have these very wide distributions. So they'll be over like a large region of the East Coast, or they'll sort of hang out in sort of the northern part of the continent. So they'll occupy a particular place, but it's pretty broad. An exception to that was Bombus franklini, which had a very sort of small range on the West Coast, which is probably part of the reason why it ended up going extinct. It's one of the bees that we think succumbed to potentially something like nosema, and then also had this really small distribution, which probably contributed to its loss. But yes, I'm not sure if this is quite the answer to your question, but there are some maybe unexpected sort of highly diverse areas. One of them is actually deserts. So weirdly, deserts actually have a really high diversity of bees, compared to some other places. Yeah.
All right. So we're going to do more questions in a little while, but we're going to get back to some of the scheduled questions as well. So one of the questions that we're going to start with is, how does what's happening kind of in the wider environment affect the bee parasite relationship? Like, is there a relationship between like where they are and what kind of parasites they have, and like how can landscapes and different landscapes help them? That was a lot, I'm sorry.
Yeah, so how does the wider sort of environment or landscape influence parasite interactions?
Yeah.
So there are kind of multiple ways in which this can happen. I want to first sort of define what it means to be talking about a landscape, or what the landscape scale is. So yeah, this is like an aerial image of actually the college, UMass, and the surrounding area. So you can see there's lots of farmland, there's some forests, but we kind of define the landscape as the scale at which an organism perceives the environment, right? Which can be like, if you think of large vertebrates like deer, whatever, that would be kind of like their territory or something like that. For bees, it's very defined. Bees are what we would call central place foragers. They have a nest, and then they forage a certain area around that nest. And that is generally defined by their body size. So smaller bees don't fly as far, bigger bees can fly much further. And sometimes bees can fly really far, but that's not really what we call their typical foraging range. So we define the landscape as like how, the space that they typically occupy.
Okay.
So this is the example of a landscape that's sort of digitized, where we have these, we take this and basically turn it into this. So we can quantify the land uses around a colony. And this is what the landscape is.
Okay.
And so, so when we kind of sum this up, we're looking at kind of things like the proportion of land that is impervious surface, meaning buildings and parking lots, and the proportion of it that's forest, or the proportion of it that is agricultural. And those things can influence host parasite relationships. An example, not necessarily from my work, but from a study that Lynn Adler's lab did work on, I think it was over the Northeast region, they were looking at the prevalence and intensity, meaning how bad the infections were of nosema in bumblebees. And they looked at many things about the landscape. And one of the things that popped out was, the amount of agricultural land and the use of fungicides in those landscapes. And what they, the hypothesis is that because the fungicides were sort of wiping out the natural microbiota of the bees, it was allowing the nosema infections to sort of take hold. So that's one example of how the sort of wider landscape can influence these infections.
So in your research, you look at different landscapes and how they affect the bee health and how this kind of relates. So like that parasites they can be susceptible to. So do different landscapes kind of contain different parasites? Can they pick them up in different ways, that sort of area? Or is it more just the sense of different plant communities affect the diseases that bees get, that sort of situation? Is there like protection, or is it kind of like just depend upon if they go to this flower, they're going to get this type of parasite sort of situation?
Oh, I see what you're saying. Yeah. So, so I think there's sort of two things. There's like the landscape scale, which is sort of happening in like a macro sense. And then we can sort of zoom into what the specific plant community is and how that might affect sort of host the parasites that bees are getting. Mm-hmm. I guess to answer that piece of it, how does the plant community potentially affect the parasites that bees are getting? I would say that our understanding of that is still very much in its infancy. It's actually one of the things that I would say like Lynn Adler's lab has sort of pioneered, is trying to understand some of those dynamics. So there's kind of multiple answers to this question. One is that if the plant community is not diverse, right? Or if it's what we call nutrient poor, that in and of itself can sort of affect whether bees sort of get overcome by a parasite infection. So something like Presidia bombi, which I described as sometimes, not being that virulent, can become much more of a problem when bees don't have good nutrition. So when the landscape is resource poor. So that's sort of one way in which the plant community can impact parasite infection. But the other question is about, do they pick up sort of specific things from different plants? I think we don't know that much about that yet, but it's almost certainly the case. So some, if you look at nectar hosts a lot of yeast, and there are different kinds of yeast. And there are studies showing that, the bees are sort of transmitting these different kinds of yeast to different flowers, and they're picking it up from different flowers. So almost certainly it is true that these different flowers, because of like something about their, pH or chemistry or whatever, are harboring sort of different microbes that bees are then interacting with. Okay. The other piece of that is that the plants themselves can do two things. One is that some plants are actually medicinal in nature. Mm-hmm. So when bees forage on them, they're getting some of these medicinal compounds in these plants. Some of them are actually toxic compounds, but in limited quantities can actually be sort of curative for something like a parasite infection. So some of the plants in the community that are medicinal can be sort of combating parasite infections.
Sorry. So just as like a follow-up to that do they know that will they seek these plants out? Do we know that far? Or is it just, it happens to be in the landscape?
There is some limited evidence that bees may engage in what we call self-medication behavior, where they actually seek out those plants in order to medicate, but it's not very well documented yet. So it also could be the case that they're just sort of incidentally, visiting these flowers and also just picking up these medicinal compounds when they do that.
Okay. And that's kind of where the diverse background of plants is important. Have access to a lot of different things. Awesome.
Right.
Cool. So what kind of defenses do bees have other than like, is it just the plants that they have defenses against parasites, or are there other defenses that they kind of have built in or anything like that?
Yeah, so bees have sort of multiple kinds of defenses against pathogens and parasites. So the first one, particularly in social bees, is this what we call hygienic behavior. So it's a behavioral defense. So bees will like groom each other and they, clean each other off, and that helps keep like ectoparasites away. So that is a kind of a big component of pest defense in social species. Solitary bees, of course, don't have that going on. They also have innate immunity. So they don't have adaptive immunity like we do, like they don't have antibodies to particular viruses, but they have an innate immune response. And so that involves a few different things. There are things called AMPs, which are antimicrobial peptides, which fight off bacterial infections. And then they also have something called an encapsulation response, which is correlated with other aspects of immune function. So encapsulation is basically these hemocytes, when there's like a foreign entity in the body, they will do two things. They'll sort of send out these cytotoxic molecules, so things that will potentially kill the invader, and they also will deposit melanin. So if this is if it's something like we haven't talked about it yet, but a parasitoid, so if it's like something like a fly larva living inside of a bee trying to grow, the bee, depending on the bee, it can potentially melanize that larva and then sort of cut off its oxygen supply and kill it. And this image here is showing you sort of different levels of melanization response, not on a larva, but on an artificial implant that we put into bees to measure their response. All the way from not a lot to a lot.
Awesome. So with like these kind of defenses and these different resources, how endangered are the bees? How worried do we have to be? Because there's a lot of kind of conversation around protect the bees and how much can they kind of do for themselves, or are we really kind of going to have to step up and fix things for them?
Yeah, well, so the answer is we should be concerned. We should be concerned. Not just bees, but insect biodiversity and insect abundance, biomass has declined pretty substantially over the last several decades. And there are particular groups of insects that appear to be more vulnerable, that have declined more. Pollinators is one of them, and dung beetles is actually another, and they're both tied to agriculture.
Okay.
So we should be concerned. What I will say is, what I always want to do is sort of distinguish between kinds of bees. So we have commercial bees, like honeybees. There's an entire industry and infrastructure around honey. They have many challenges, but there are people working tirelessly to diversify their genetics, to tailor genetics to fight certain parasites. So I would say overall, they're actually doing fine, even though they tend to be sort of held up as like the poster child for bees, being in trouble. The bees we really need to be concerned about are those that don't have that kind of human support, that are not domesticated. So our wild species are declining. It is not across the board. Like there are some bumblebees, for example, where their ranges are actually expanding. So they're doing okay. And then there are other bumblebees that are experiencing, major range contractions. Overall, though, what that means is that we're experiencing like an increase in what we call dominance in communities. So some bees are becoming much more, they make up a larger proportion of the bumblebees that are there. And we're losing biodiversity overall. So that's not.
No. All right. So what can we do to help the bees? Like, what is it? Is there a way we can help them get better? Is there something we can actively be doing kind of on our own basis that will help them?
Yes, absolutely. So there are multiple reasons why bees are suffering, but a major reason is the conversion of natural habitat, which contains nesting resources and floral resources, to other human land uses. That includes agriculture, that includes, urban development. And so probably the number one thing I would ever suggest to people is to plant flowers to give bees food, and to be very aware of where those flowers are coming from. Because sometimes, like if you'll go to sort of a big box store and buy plants, they will actually be treated with pesticides. And pesticides, of course, are one of the reasons why bees are not doing so well. So plant flowers, be aware of where they're coming from. If you go, I'll have some links at the end, but if you go to the Xerces Society, if you want to write that down, they have really great resources for where to access plants. They have it by region, what kinds of plants are really great. And then they're also, there's the UMass Extension. We have a pollinator extension specialist who has made a really great website and is available to sort of answer some of those questions. And then Western Mass Pollinator Network also has information about specific plants that you can install. So I would say habitat is kind of the biggest thing, like to create habitat for bees. And then if anyone on the call happens to be someone who farms either as a profession or sort of on the side, we also have these things called bee-friendly farming practices, which is things like no tilling. Because when we till the soil, most species are actually ground nesters. So when we till up that soil, we disrupt all of their, we disrupt nesting habitat. So yeah, so those are the kinds of things that I would recommend people do. The one thing I actually would not recommend people do is to keep a honeybee hive. There are good reasons to keep honeybees. Like if you think that they're just fascinating, if you want to make honey, if you want to be a beekeeper, solid. But if you're doing it because you think it will, sort of save the bees and increase bee populations, that's not a good reason to do it. And that's because honeybees, particularly in certain kinds of environments, can actually create a lot of competition for resources for native bees.
Okay. And I'm guessing native species are probably good for that sort of like flowers when you're looking for the different types, if you want to kind of emphasize that like native species as well.
Yes, native species, I would definitely recommend that. And if you go to the Cersei Society,
Awesome.
That's kind of what they're promoting as well.
And we can definitely share this on the website as well. So we'll post that later and we can have that up there. So we're going to kind of move on to our last question and answer, just kind of finish off. Is there anything you want to cover right before we do, or anything I missed that you just want to do a shout out for? It's okay if that's no, but.
Who, me?
Yeah.
If I want to shout, okay. One quick thing. One type of parasite I didn't get to mention, it's actually not a parasite, it's a parasitoid, and it's my favorite, so I am going to mention it. There are not just these, but there are other types of these organisms. These are parasitoids, so this is a fly, it's called a canopid fly, and I think they're really cool. It's very Halloween appropriate. They lay their eggs inside of, in this case, this canopid fly, its host is bumblebees. So it lays its egg inside of a bumblebee. Then a larva then grows over the course of like 10 to 12 days. It consumes the insides of the bee during that time. The bee is remarkably like flying around for many of the days. And then just prior to the bee's death, in some bumblebees, the fly somehow, we don't know how, manipulates the bee into burying itself into the ground. And then the fly pupates and then emerges the next year. It's crazy.
Oh, that is horrifying and very Halloween appropriate.
It is. So it's not, so I guess my point is it's not just these microparasites that cause bees, trouble. There are other pests that they also have to deal with too.
All right. So we're going to get to some questions that we have already entered in, and we'll get to some others that for people that have raised their hands. So hold on one second. We're going to start with, is there a difference in life cycle and health-wise between wild bees and colony kept by a beekeeper? You touched on that a little bit with the honeybees, but is there like a big difference in life cycle or like the health level in like what parasites can happen, et cetera?
Yeah, so there are probably two ways to answer this question. The first is perhaps like maintained honeybee hives compared to feral colonies, which also do exist. So I should say, honeybees are not native to North America. They were introduced here hundreds of years ago by European settlers who brought them over from Europe. So we have the European honeybee is what we have here. There is some interesting research showing that these feral hives, these wild hives, actually have sort of better immune defenses against the primary pest of honeybees, which is the varroa mite. Like the varroa mite is the number one issue that beekeepers and honeybees face. So there's some indication that these wild bees, for whatever reason, actually have better immune defenses, and that might have to do with like how they're nesting, or it's unclear. But so that there is a distinction there between what's kept and then what's sort of wild. And then I guess you could also answer that question as between commercial species and wild species, and whether there's a distinction there. There are some wild species like there's one kind of bumblebee in particular that is commercialized. And I say the commercialized species are the ones that do so well in spite of any really conditions. So they seem to be okay kind of in the face of these pathogens, whereas other wild species are not. I'll also say we know very, very little, like really almost the kind of next to nothing about the kinds of pathogens that the majority of wild bees actually harbor. So that includes all of these solitary species that don't have a nest. And that's like the majority of bees that we have. And we don't really know much about their pathogens at all.
So another question is, how serious are at-home lawn chemicals affecting like the biome, and are like the issues of like the parasite problem also, like is there weakening resistance when they're exposed to these sorts of chemicals and stuff like that?
That's a good question. I'm not sure I have the exact answer to that. Most of my knowledge about pesticides is from sort of like commercial farming versus at-home lawn care. But certainly, you know, if you sort of think about the pest, you know, the amount of chemicals that people might apply over like, you know, flowering area in an entire suburban neighborhood, that could amount to a lot. But I think the question is, how does pesticide influence, how does that influence
Both
immune
the
function
bee
or the
gut biome and their kind of resistance to parasites?
their resistance to parasites? Yeah, so I don't know how it affects the microbiome. I'm not sure if that information is actually out there, because we're still kind of characterizing the microbiome in general. But you know, again, that a study that I referenced earlier, which saw basically at a regional scale, they were able to link these increased nosema infections with a higher use of a fungicide. So that would suggest that some chemicals can alter the natural biome of a bee, which sort of gives room for other things to take root, right? It's the same thing like when humans take antibiotics. So that I think the evidence sort of points to that, yes, being the case.
Okay. So we have a couple of questions that are just about, and do you have a moment just to go over a little bit? I don't want to keep you if it's okay to stay for a few more. All right. So one of the questions that are kind of similar is, what's some examples of medicinal plants and what are the best plants to plant to benefit bees?
Yes, we're still working on this question. And not all of the evidence always totally lines up, but so the primary plant that we are working on in the Adler lab is actually sunflower. It was kind of crazy, but it was an unexpected finding. So when bumblebees in particular consume sunflower pollen, it dramatically reduces Crithidia infections in particular in bumblebees. In honeybees, it's also, the evidence is a little weaker, but may actually reduce nosema infections and potentially some viruses. So the sunflower pollen, for whatever reason, has this medicinal aspect to it. That said, sunflower pollen is also very nutrient poor. So I wouldn't go and just plant only sunflower, but if you have that kind of in your mix of plants, that's a really good one to have.
Okay.
And then things like mint, sometimes some of them have a chemical called thymol. And that is also potentially kind of like a medicinal, has a medicinal effect. I believe thymol is actually like what they use in Listerine.
Oh, okay, interesting. So one question that's really quick. What is that picture? What are those blue flowers in your picture right here?
Oh, I think it's Bluebeard. It's my father-in-law's prized master garden. There are dahlias in the background as well. But yes, I'm pretty sure that's Bluebeard or Blue Tongue. I can look it up and let you know.
Okay.
I'm actually, I have to say, I am not 100% sure that this is a native species.
I see. That's okay. We understand. And then one of the questions kind of as a follow-up from the pesticide question, which I'm not sure whether you'll be able to, but does the copper fungicide that I spray on my tomatoes affect bees?
Oh, was the chemical name there?
Copper fungicide is what it says.
Copper. That is a good question. I mean, that's considered to be an organic treatment. So not a pesticide, but is that potentially bad for bees? That's a good question. I'm going to say I don't know off the top of my head, but I can look into that and get back to you about that through Julia.
We can do a post update of, hey, here's the questions. And then I think we've got maybe one or two more. The blue flower is Caryopteris is an answer.
Thank
In
you.
fact, from my mother, in fact, who is a gardener. So we can.
Nice.
All right. So what is colony collapse disorder, and is it caused by parasites?
Yes, so colony collapse disorder is specific to honeybees. It was a phenomenon that first came on the scene in 2006, 2007. And for anyone who might be unfamiliar, basically what was happening is beekeepers would show up to their hives and like nobody was home. So like overnight, the hive had just sort of collapsed and the bees were gone, which obviously is not normal. And the cause is actually still not known. I mean, the one good thing I'll say is that even though that phenomenon isn't totally gone, it has sort of rolled off, and it didn't end up like, we had something like at peak, like 30% hive losses that were owing to this syndrome, and that did not accelerate. So we're not losing more and more because of that, which is why you probably don't hear about it as much anymore. The cause still is not known. People really, really invested like many resources and much time into figuring this out. And what the sort of the best working hypothesis is that it is a combination of stressors that that bees experience in their sort of migratory lifestyle, sort of moving across the country for agriculture, that has caused this to happen. So it's potentially things like pesticide exposure, lack of good nutrition in large monocultures that basically make them immune deficient, which then allows these viruses or parasites to take over, and would actually kind of explain why there was no single virus or parasite identified as causing this problem.
Okay. Interesting. That's really interesting and a little sad, but really cool.
Very sad, very sad.
And then another quick question that's very topical is the murder hornets that have arrived in Washington State. They're obviously dangerous to humans, but will they have any effect on the bees in Washington? Do you know if there's going to be like an impact on the local species?
Yeah, so, well, my hope and the reason why you see people launching such a fierce effort is that if we can find them now, when they first established, we can potentially root them out and then they won't be a problem. That is hope. Right now, it's a very sort of geographically contained problem.
Okay.
If that doesn't happen, the major threat that they probably pose is to our honeybees.
Okay.
So these are, I believe they're, they call them murder hornets, but they're Japanese hornets that normally prey on Japanese honeybees, which have over time, because they've co-evolved, they have a defense against these hornets. They actually they form like a giant ball around the hornet and then they like bake it to death.
Okay.
Because their thermal tolerance is higher than the hornet. Crazy.
Like that.
Yes, but our honeybees, the European honeybees, do not have that defense. And so that would be a problem. It would be a predator against which they do not have a natural defense.
Okay. All right. So that is just about everything that we have. So I'm going to kind of wrap up. Thank you so much for joining us. This was an amazing talk. It was really enjoyable and we learned a lot. And just to the chat in general, thank you everybody for joining us, all the audience. Our next event will have the same format. It'll be held on November 12th, and we'll be discussing plants and plant chemicals with Dr. Rosemary Malfi. And we can check that out on our website, which is oebsciencecafe.org for more information and to subscribe to our mailing list if you haven't already. So everybody, will join me in saying very much, so much thank you, because this was great. This is a really cool topic.
Thank you for having me. It was very fun.
All right, so this will be posted. So I'm going to stop recording, but